We're moving on now to the Mishnah that we learned on Shabbat afternoon, chapter 3 of Pierki Avot. And as we discussed in previous classes, Pierki Avot is aligned with the Sfirot, with the attributes, with the divine attributes. Chapter 1 is aligned with Chesed. And that's why in chapter 1 begins Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai Umasal Yeshua. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it over Yeshua to the Skinim, to the elders, etc. That's Chesed. It's a transmission from above to below. As Chesed is aligned with water, and water trickles downwards. Chapter 2 begins with the Rabbi says which is the path that a person should choose for himself, etc. That's from below to above, that the person is doing the choosing in climbing upwards. And that's Gvura, like a fire that rises upwards. Chapter 3 is aligned with Tiferes. Synergy, harmony, compassion, truth. So the thread through chapter 3 is Tiferes. One of the Mishnayot, as the Rabbi teaches, that it's not enough just to read or learn Pierki Avot on Shabbat afternoon, but it's important to delve to at least one Mishnah. So this Shabbat afternoon, we started with one of the first Mishnayot in chapter 3. Rabbi Hanina, the administrator Kohen, the assistant Kohen, instructed, pray for the welfare of the kingdom, the government. For if it wasn't for the government, if it wasn't for the kingdom, each person would swallow their friends up alive. On the surface level, what this would seem to imply is that Rabbi Hanina is instructing that we have to pray that the government, whichever government we're living under, should be in a good standing. That we should pray for the welfare because government keeps order in society. And if it wasn't for the government, seemingly what Rabbi Hanina is saying, that society would fall into decay, into chaos, and then cannibalism would break out amongst people. People just simply cannibalize each other. They would murder each other. It's very interesting because Rabbi Hanina himself was amongst the Asar Arugi HaMalchut. Rabbi Hanina himself was amongst the 10 martyrs that were murdered so viciously by the Roman Emperor, the Roman government. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, as we learned several times, and is brought out in the Musaf of Yom Kippurim davening. And nevertheless, he is the one that instructed to daven for the sake of the government. On the surface level, because no government is not a good thing. People need a framework. People need guidance. So having no government in itself brings disarray into the world. And we see what happens when society makes people apprehensive and suspicious of its own government. Not to say that the government is perfect, but understanding that even with a less than perfect government, there's still structure. But obviously, that's not the implication of this Mishnah. Because Pierki Avot, as we learned several times already, as per the teaching in the Gemara, doesn't focus on our legality and right and wrong, on our legal obligations and what's right and what's wrong. For that, we have all the other sections of the revealed part of the Torah. Pierki Avot teaches us how to look and view, perceive the world from beyond the letter of the law, from above, from Hashem's perspective. So what is so deep about this Mishnah? So let's delve into the talk in itself. Question number one that arises in regarding Rabbi Hanina's statement, pray for the sake of the welfare of the government, etc. The first question that arises is, when there is a conflict between two people, and that conflict is severe enough that people start disliking each other and chas v'shalom hating each other to the extent that they're willing to take someone else's life, well, obviously, at that point, when one wants to take the other one's life, they're not friends. There's no camaraderie between them. They detest each other. But if we pay close attention to Rabbi Hanina's instruction, teaching, if we pay close attention to the verbiage itself, we see that Rabbi Hanina says, a person would swallow up his friend alive. Underlying and emphasize the word, his friend.
You say take his life, meaning literally or metaphorically?
He would swallow up his friend alive. And so, if he's his friend, when the Mishnah is saying he's his friend right now, it means that it wasn't friendly in the past, that they had a good relationship and there was an outing, there was some sort of an outing, something happened, and then they descended into conflict. But the Mishnah is speaking that he is his friend now. In other words, there's camaraderie between them. They're connected. They love each other. Why would someone who loves someone else want to hurt them? That's question number one. Another question, the verbiage, each person would swallow up his friend alive. What does it mean, swallow up his friend? If Rabbi Hanina meant to say that people would murder each other if it wasn't for the government, in other words, there would be Lord of the Flies, there would be anarchy in the world. Then he should have just used that word. People would, God forbid, take each other's lives. But over here, Rabbi Hanina did not say that. Rabbi Hanina says, if it wasn't for the welfare of the kingdom, of the government, each person would swallow up his friend alive, not take his friend's life. In other words, we're not talking about cannibalism because, first and foremost, on the most logical aspect from the framework of Pierki Avot takes us beyond the letter of the law. It's not teaching us about rights and wrongs and do's and don'ts. That's the other segments of the Torah, the other sections of the Torah. So we can't possibly be speaking about murder. Prat, specifically the fact that Rabbi Hanina doesn't use the verbiage that implies murder. What does it imply to swallow someone up alive? It's a whole entire discussion which we're going to be delving into. A third question, Rabbi Hanina is instructing us to daven for the sake of the welfare of the kingdom, of the government. Well, Pierki Avot, as per most commentaries, is learned in order to refine one's attributes, one's emotive attributes. How does davening for the government help oneself refine their attributes? In order to understand this, let's first delve into a very, very important element of life. We realize more and more how imperative it is to work on oneself, on one's emotive self. to refine our emotions, to refine our perceptions, etc., etc. But most of the time, the way we understand this self-work is a means to an end. In other words, I need to work on myself so I can be more relatable to, that I could relate better to others, that I could accomplish a certain element of my life that if I wouldn't work on my emotive self, if I wouldn't do self-work, I would never be able to achieve it without this. So, with no other option, I have to work on myself. In other words, if I'm not going to work on my chesed, I won't be able to give of myself. If I won't work on my chesed, I won't be good, I won't be charitable, etc., etc. If I won't work on my gvura, on my strictness, on my inner discipline, then I won't be able to dispel negative influences when they come towards me. If a person doesn't work on the attributes of netzach, of grit, of perseverance, the person will never be able to stand against their own inclination, or any challenges for that matter. They'll just give up. So in other words, each one of these emotive works leads to something greater than itself. And that's how we would understand it. That self-work is a lead up to something greater than yourself, that without this self-work you can never achieve. Thereby, self-work is nothing more than a means to an end. But we know that Chassidus explains that avodas tikkun hamidos, the service of working on one's emotive attributes, is not just a means to an end, but in itself is a means. In itself is an end. There is an actual purpose in working on the attributes for its own sake. There's an actual reason and purpose of working on the emotions and refining one's emotions for its own sake, even without a greater end to it, in it itself as an end. In other words, even if a person doesn't find any, and we're talking about it in reality, even if a person doesn't find any character flaws, emotive flaws, so a person would say, well, I don't need to work. I'm fine. I'm generous. I'm disciplined. My ambitions are healthy, etc., etc. But even in such a case, the person is nevertheless instructed that you must work on yourself constantly. The Noam Elimelech, from Elimelech Alvizhinsk, Reb Zusha's brother, explained that the entire purpose of Chassidus, and by the way, this is mirrored by the previous Rebbe who once asked the same question, and as well as the Ruzhiner Rebbe, that the purpose of Chassidus is to refine one's emotive attributes. To the extent that a person, the phrase is, one can break one's own back, but without Chassidus, you won't change a single attribute in yourself. And this, of course, is based on the Midrash. It tells us that the reason why Hashem gave us the mitzvot is in order to refine creation. Like what? Like refining silver. In order to refine silver, it has to be put on a flame, and the fire in itself removes the impurity from the silver, leaves silver in its pure state. So too, Hashem desires to remove from within, from within us, from outside of us, any impurities that may have seeped in through either environmental or egocentric considerations, and most of the time it's both. In other words, Hashem doesn't just say, I want you to put on tefillin. I would like you to don on tefillin. I would like you to keep Shabbos. I would like you to eat kosher. I would like you to give tzedakah. In other words, Hashem doesn't just desire the mechanics. He wants our inner selves involved with everything that we do. And so Hashem gave us the mitzvot not just for us to perform rituals, but as implied by the Midrash, the mitzvot themselves refine us, like silver is refined. And if self-work, emotional refinement is so paramount to our service, and it is a service in its own, let's start really understanding what this service is all about. So let's go through some attributes, some emotive attributes, to understand what is their desired function. How does a person know if their emotions are healthy? Just because a person has love to give, and just because a person is equipped to self-discipline and self-regulate, etc., doesn't mean without work, that love or the discipline will flow in a holy manner. Let's first delve into Chesed, into the first of 7 attributes, kindness, the capacity to be kind, to be generous, to love, to be fluid, to be malleable, etc., etc. Chesed in itself is the root of the ability to give of yourself and to give yourself over when you see someone else needs. Chesed allows us to be socially apt and to be able to connect to others. We know that love that flows between people aligns them. As we spoke about many times, ahava, aleph, hey, vet, hey, numerologically is equivalent to 13, which is equal to the word echad, 1. Aleph, chadalid is also equal to 13. And so love allows us to connect and to bond between a person and their fellow, between spouses, between a parent and their child. It opens up a flow between them. Chesed allows us to be expansive, to open up. But Chesed, with all of its virtues, kindness, the capacity for kindness, with all of its virtues, could in itself be a trapping if it's not worked upon. Not only for the person who is doing the chesed, who is endowing the kindness, etc., but even to the recipient. We're going to see now that unhealthy kindness damages both the giver and the receiver. For example, a person who is so immersed in giving, they love giving. They will give and they will give and they will give and they will give until they have nothing else to give. A person who just naturally gives and is naturally kind often doesn't leave too much room for themselves in the picture. And because of that reason, the kindness over time will deplete the person of themselves. And the more kindness, the faster the pace of depletion occurs. And over time, that kindness in itself will turn into resentment. A person says, but look how much I'm giving, look how much I'm helping, look how much I'm doing. And that will cause resentment in the person. But not only this affects ourselves, as we said before, but it also affects the recipient. Because someone who wants to be the chief giver, the one who gives everyone at all times, creates an impediment in the recipient, in the receiver. Because what happens when the person is no longer there? Then the receiver themselves will find themselves without any thought. What do I do now? In 1994, after Gimel Tammuz, after the Rebbe's passing, New York Times came out with a humongous prediction that Chabad is done. Lubavitch is done. Because from their estimation, the Rebbe was the one that generated all this chesed, and we, of course, were receiving and following instruction, but without the Rebbe's formal physical presence, then everything's going to dissipate. Because when you have la havdil, to differentiate, a humongous philanthropist who carries all the institutions, and one day he's gone, and he didn't leave anything to institutions when the institutions go into dire straits, because they became reliant on this one particular person. But we see now, Baruch Hashem, that the Rebbe's chesed wasn't a natural chesed. And we're going to see what that means, because obviously Chabad Lubavitch not only did not falter, it became exponentially greater and greater and greater and greater, and everyone recognizes this.
Rabbi, what if someone doesn't necessarily want to be or not be the chief giver, but Hashem puts people in front of them?
And nevertheless, the chesed has to be done correctly. And we're going to see what it means. There's another drawback with unrefined kindness. That unrefined kindness, what does that mean from a Chassidic perspective? It means an animalistic, an egocentric generated kindness. That the person is doing the kindness. I need to be kind. I need love in my life. I want to give. But if that kind of egocentric kindness, the I, doesn't leave too much room for the other person. And it doesn't really take the other person's need to be loved, to be kind, and so on and so forth too. Often that type of love is smothering. It chokes the life of the recipient of this love. Because this type of love, while it might be sweet, the person is willing to go out, all out for this person, do everything for this person, but eventually becomes toxic. For example, we see this many times, unfortunately, with parents and their children. If the mother or the father didn't get an adequate love, an adequate alignment growing up, and didn't learn how to self-regulate, the type of love that they give to the children is often unhealthy. What makes it unhealthy? So as we spoke about in the parenting class, Shlomo HaMelech teaches, and this is the foundation of raising children and teaching students, and they're one and the same often, is Chanoch lena'ar al pi darko. Educate a child based on their pathways and their needs. In other words, we raise our children based on their needs, not based on our needs. And often, parents who were not raised correctly and did not do the self-work often mistake that the love that they give is genuine love. As we're going to see in tomorrow night's relationship class, and we already discussed we opened this discussion last week, the animal soul, the ego is capable of loving, but it's not capable of truly loving. It loves the one that makes it feel good about itself. Its love in itself is a form of nourishment for itself. We see this with parents that raise their child based on their own needs because they weren't loved, so they need someone who they could love to make them feel, I never received this, I'm going to give this to you, I didn't have these toys, I didn't have this, I'm going to give everything to you. And I'm going to love you so much, and I'm going to always protect you and everything. But that in itself could create spoiled children. I had a student once that unfortunately he wasn't doing well, and no matter how many times I sat with him and I spoke with him, and he wasn't changing courses, and eventually I had to fail him. But before failing him, and it took me so much, it was very difficult for me to do this because I really cared and I loved this student. He was a good boy. But he was negligent. He neglected the schoolwork, the homework, the tests, the quizzes. So I once sat with his father, and I said to him, "Who sits and does homework with him?" He says, he's not interested in his homework. I said, well, that's the issue. I said, what does he do when he comes home? He says, Rabbi, from 4:30 when he comes back home until 11, 12 o'clock, he's on his Xbox. I said, well, but why would you let him play like this? Okay, 30, 40 minutes, an hour, but 8 hours, and instead of his responsibilities? He said, yeah, but he doesn't listen when I tell him to take it off, to get off of it. He doesn't listen to his mom, and I'm often not home either. So I said, okay, then you, the father, take the Xbox away. He said, no, I can't do that. I says, why? He says, because he's not going to like me. I said, what do you mean he's not going to like you? You're the father. You have to raise the child based on his needs, not what you need. We don't raise our children because we want them to love us or anything like that. What does the child need? Because as brought down in many parenting books, unhealthy love, smothering love, giving the child what they don't need, being a helicopter parent towards a child and not allowing the child to develop themselves because of an inconsistency within the parent themselves, creates many anxieties in the child. And often that's the root of the failure to thrive and failure to launch, that the child remains a child even in their adulthood. Because if a parent, I love you so much and I don't want you to cry, and if you have a conflict with your teacher, I'm going to go and resolve it for you. You have an issue with one of your friends, don't worry, I'm going to go speak to his mom, and if not, I'm going to go and confront your friend, and if you didn't bring your lunch, don't worry, I'll stop everything and I'm going to drive to your school, and if you miss the bus, don't worry about it, I'll defer my appointments and just show up and I'll take you to school. that creates meek and weak children. It creates a human being, and I see this through and through, that lacks coping skills, that won't know how to deal and respond to life. And for them, everything is going to be a reaction. As soon as something doesn't occur in the way that they wanted, that they needed, that they expected, from their point of entitlement, because that's how they were raised, to be entitled, they're going to go off the handle. They're going to have tantrums in childhood and tantrums in adulthoods. These children are never going to develop their own strength. It's akin to a parent who never teaches their child to walk, because they don't want to see their child fall and bruise their legs. So instead of it says, I'll carry them. But what happens when you're there in adulthood? You can't carry them. Are you going to break your back? And at that point, the child becomes frustrated with the parent. People often ask, and this is parenthetically, but not so much, but people often ask, why doesn't Hashem speak to us like He did in the earlier times, in the biblical times? Why don't we see open miracles, although Baruch Hashem many times we do, but the kind of miracles that we saw, the splitting of the sea and so on and so forth, like we did in the biblical times? Because as the Torah describes in the prophet, that when the Jewish people came out, we were like a youth, a nar. And at early stages, Hashem treated like a child. Does our bidding, He feeds us, He clothes us, He speaks to us, He tells what's right and wrong. But the purpose of having a child is not to have a cute little child. The purpose of having a child is to raise that child to become a mensch. And at some point, the child needs to take responsibility for themselves. As a famous educational axiom goes, what is the gauge of a good teacher? And for that matter, what is a gauge of a good parent? A gauge of a good parent or a good teacher is that the child or the student no longer technically needs them in order to thrive. That they should grow independent of their parents or of their teachers, but with all the information that was passed on to them, that was endowed into them, and they take that and they bring it to the next level while raising their own bars. Because if the love that's given, the alignment that's given is untapered, is coming from the ego, then it, God forbid, impedes the child or the recipient of that kindness from growing within themselves, from developing their own soul talents, their own abilities. And eventually they'll catch up, and that's when the anxieties come from, when the child faces issues in the life. But the problem is, and this is a problem, that from the animal soul's perspective, once it gets used to this type of input of constant kindness and constant generosity, and you don't have to work and don't worry about it, then in its emotive intelligence, which is very self-centered, is going to constantly be afraid, now that I don't have this, everything could go wrong, and therefore it's going to be in a perpetual state of anxiety. It's very interesting because there's an anecdote of two neighbors who both had beautiful gardens in front of their homes, and they both tend to it on a daily basis. The untrained one, in other words, he didn't know so much about gardening. He knew the basics. The flowers need water and sunlight, etc., etc. So out of his love for his garden, he would irrigate the garden every day. He would give so much water to make sure that the plants are thriving and so on and so forth. While the other one, the more seasoned one, the one who was actually a gardener, would give water, but in measures. Certainly not as much as his neighbor. One day there was a humongous rainstorm overnight, and they both came to see the results of the rainstorm. What did it affect their garden? The one who constantly irrigated his garden found that his entire garden was uprooted. While the other one who irrigated but sparsely, his garden withstood all the storm. So the ones whose garden was uprooted turned to the other one and says, "What's your secret? How did your plant?" He says, "You know what? It was in their irrigation. Because you irrigated. Well, it's great to help the flowers technically grow, but that type of irrigation impeded the growth of the roots, because the plants never needed to develop deep roots into the ground because they were receiving all their sustenance from you. So their roots were very shallow. While I gave just enough of water to be able to help the flowers develop their own roots and go deep into the ground where there's more of a reservoir of hydration for the flowers. So when this storm came, they were firmly planted in. And giving unhealthy love, even when in other words, you don't want to hurt the person. You really, really want to show them how much you love them. But if you love them, you have to love them and give them what they need, not what you need. As we discussed in the marriage in the relationship class last week, and we're going to further develop in this week, marriage and any type of relationship for that matter, aside from literally the transactional relationship, it's not about what I'm gaining from you. It's what I'm doing for you. How am I serving you? Not what you're doing for me. Why aren't you serving me? Because that type of love that is over generous and unfiltered and so on and so forth, that's not a love that I'm serving you with. This love is I'm serving me with. And you happen to be the footnote in the service. So we see, it's very interesting, that there's a very famous axiom that dire times create strong people create strong times creates complacency creates weak people create weak times. In other words, now we see that in our generation, because of where we were raised, and I happen to feel that we were raised with all the craziness and the way we were raised. Nevertheless, it was more in line with good upraising. Of course, there was a lot left to be desired, but because we grew up and we didn't have, now we automatically have to give this to the children without considering is it good or not. I had a parent last week tell me, "Rabbi, my child has developed some toxic behavioral patterns. He doesn't even look at us anymore when he speaks to us because he's so focused on the phone, and the phone is driving him insane. I said, you gave your child a phone at 8 years old? He says, no, we didn't give him a phone. He uses his mother's. I said, well, it doesn't matter. You're giving your child a phone? He says, yeah, because his friend has it, and if he doesn't have it, then he has a tantrum. I said, but you're saying in the same sentence, you see what it's doing to him. He says, what should he do? Then he's not gonna like us. I said, no, you're not here to be liked by your children. That's not. There's no commandment for children to love their parents. There's a commandment to respect and honor. And that's for their benefit, not for the parents' benefit. The respect and honor that the Torah commands the children is not for the parents' benefit. It's literally for the children's benefit. As we discussed in the parenting class. But there's no commandment from the children to love their parents. And therefore, there shouldn't be an impediment. Well, if I take the phone away, they're not going to love me. You have to ask, if this is a commandment to honor and respect the parents upon them, then is giving them the phone helping them, will it aid them in being more respectful and more honorable towards the parents, which is psychologically important for their growth? Or is it going to take it away from them? So we see now that a person with the capacity to love and to give, if that love is not healthy, if it's not holy, not only that love is not a healthy love and a holy love, is destructive. Let's look at Gvura, the second attribute, from the left side. The Mishnah in this Shabbat afternoon's Pierki Avot chapter 4 asks, who is mighty? Ezeu Gibor. And what does it say? Hakovesh et Yitzro, someone who is able to sublimate, to subdue his own inclination. What does that mean? Gvura is the ability to inner discipline, focus, calculate in a healthy and holy manner, which allows us to be able to subdue the inclination that doesn't fit this point, this purpose. It doesn't match up with me. Usually we see that someone who is Gvura looks at every single person from a focused perspective. It could be, sometimes if it's not tapered, we're going to see, it could be very rigid. As opposed to Chesed, which wants to give, Gvura wants to withhold unless the person is an absolutely worthy recipient. Because as explained in Chassidus, both Chesed and Gvura agree that influence needs to be given to the right one. They both agree. The only difference is the standard of what does it mean, the right one. Chesed has an almost non-discerning perspective if it's not refined. So give everything to all the people at all the times. Everyone deserves. Well, Gvura says, of course you need to give, but let's make sure that they're worthy of it. Gvura will say, someone who has a Gvura will say, well, of course you need to give, but you don't have to give everything. The Gvura will check, the person of Gvura will check everything multiple times and then think again and calculate and so on and so forth. And he is not going to jump into every new idea quickly. To a certain extent, he might even be closed. But he definitely has proper borders. He knows his limitations. He knows where he could go and where he cannot go. A Gvura person is able to contract himself and contract his personality. Why? Because he is not immersed in himself. He is able to automatically feel the other person. He's able to get into the other person's mind. Because it's not about himself. It's about the other person. Rabbi Mendel once invited Rabbi Kravitsky, the Shliach of Belgium. He was speaking to him in 770. He was about to get married, and Rabbi Kravitsky asked him, I'm getting married, any advice? And he said, did you buy the ring yet? He says, yes, I did. He says, I want to see it. Could you bring it over? So Rabbi Kravitsky thought that perhaps Rabbi Mendel was asking regarding the kashrut of the ring. If there's any inscriptions. So he brings him the ring, and Rabbi Mendel carefully inspects it, and says, tell me, what do you see as what do you think is the most valuable point of this ring? So he looks and says, well, it's gold, and it's 14 karat, whatever it is, and he says, yeah, but what's the most valuable part? So Reb Shabtai says he knew it better than to answer the second time. So he says he was waiting for Reb Mendel. Reb Mendel says the most valuable part of the ring is actually the hollowness in the middle of the ring. Without the hollowness, it's nothing more than a slab of gold. What makes a ring is the center hollowness, which allows the ring donor to put it on. And Mendel says, what is the lesson over here from the ring? In order to have a healthy relationship, you need to create an empty space for the other person to be themselves, to accept them. Because if it's all one slab of gold, there's no more room for the other person to don on the ring. In other words, you can't affect the kiddushin. You can't affect the marriage. You can't execute the marriage. It's specifically when the other person is able to remove themselves from the picture and see who is this person and let them be who they are, and without telling them something, you need to be different for me. In other words, you need to be my extension. In order for you to be worthy and valuable enough to get my attention and my connection and my sincerity and my intimacy. Because again, that stems from unhealthy chesed. It has to be my extension. So you too has to be my extension. In other words, it teaches, Reb Mendel says, that the hollowness in the ring in which we execute the marriage with teaches us that you have to accept the person for who they are, their quirks, their personality issues, and even their crazinesses. Otherwise, you're not accepting the person, you're accepting the parts of the person that makes you feel happy, and everything else you're pushing away. That's the power of Gvura. It allows the person, as the Mishnah says, HaKovesh Yisro, to overcome their own inclination, to give a limitation to how much they can spread outwards. Like someone once came to the third Lubavitch Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and says, Rebbe, I feel that everyone's stepping on me in shul. Everybody puts like stepping on me is a phrase like I'm being stepped on. You know, I feel like I'm constantly being judged upon. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, well, who told you to lie down all over the floor of the shul? To spread yourself all over the shul? Like I shared once a cartoon cell from a newspaper that I saw in a dentist's office. The guy was in the psychologist's office in therapy, and the caption on the bottom says, "Doctor, I feel everyone steps all over me, always steps all over me," while the guy is literally laying on by the door as a mat. Says, well, if you don't want people to step all over you, why do you spread yourself in such a way? Why do you put yourself in these situations? But sometimes the need for acceptance, the need for love, but it's selfish. Everybody, of course, needs to be accepted. That's essential. Everyone needs love. That's essential. But is it real love or is it animal love? Ego love. First way to taper that animal love is through gvura, to make sure that there's gvur shebechesed. That love should go in the way that the recipient needs, not the way that you need it. We'll continue to see Mr. Hashem tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
By the way, this is very important to inject here on a parenthetical level, but not so parenthetical. I speak to a lot of parents about bringing their children from public school to yeshiva. And often I hear, well, it's not convenient for us, and this and that. Do you want them to grow up to be a healthy human being? Of course. Do you want them to be a proud Jew? Of course. So why do you send them into the garbage of garbage? Don't you see what the public school is doing to the children of today? Of course we see it, but we don't want to create issues at home. He's going to go there and he's going to learn and he's going to see that we don't keep, and it's going to create confusion. So while the logic is and the argument is correct, but what does that mean? That means just the opposite. Then your aim is to raise your child, not to create a carbon copy of you. And so if in the previous generation, maybe it was still understanding, okay, public school, because when I first came here, people said, well, public school is obviously is free, and they have kosher food there, and they could walk with tzitzit and yarmulke, and they could be Jewish and everything. That could have maybe be a argument. But in today's world, we see what's happening in the schools. There's no question. A parent who sincerely loves their child cannot allow their child to go to public school, because Am Yisrael Chai V'Kayam depends in essential on the Torah, and not just coming to hear the Torah once a week, but to learn how to think and how to speak and how to communicate and how to be as a Torah instructs us. To teach us that there's a God and He is very much involved in our lives and He cares about what we do and so on and so forth. And that is not something at all that's discussed in public schools, just the opposite. So yeah, maybe we didn't grow up that way. But just because we didn't grow up with maybe cars or food at home, does that mean, okay, so we didn't grow up with that, we should starve our children? No. We have to give their children the best of the best. So as a reference from this, Rabbi Kravitsky made, Baruch Hashem says that any child who's brought from public school for the next upcoming year will, if their parents cannot afford full tuition, they could get between a $5,000 to $8,000 scholarship to come to the school, to come to school. And there's after school programming both in the school and in JCC. We have to do everything for our children, including, be comfortable to be uncomfortable, but raise them for what they need. We need to give them, provide the moral, spiritual, holy compass that's, as the Rebbe said, the common denominator for Am Yisrael Chai for every generation, notwithstanding where we were or what situation and geographical and so, was always the Torah. When you remove the Torah from the Jewish people, unfortunately, so if you're hearing this in person, if you're hearing this over the podcast, contact Chabad of Great Neck and ask to speak to Rabbi Gazinski or to Chali Gazinski or to Sarah Kravitsky or to Chomi Azagri or to Jasmine Rahmani and schedule a tour with the school. You will be doing your grandchildren a essential favor. Let's continue tomorrow.